The Galactic Council Hall was a monolithic structure, older than most civilizations that now thrived within its jurisdiction. It loomed above the city of Velnar Prime, where the luminous gas clouds of the central nebula bathed everything in a perpetual blue glow. The hall's vast chamber held hundreds of delegates, each representing a species that had claimed its place in the grand order of the galaxy. Lyrian sat among them, listening as the High Elder of the Zelthari stood to speak. The Zelthari were the oldest race known to exist, their records stretching back so far that no one, not even them, could recall a time before their presence. Their wisdom was legend, their warnings never taken lightly. Yet it was this very reputation that troubled Lyrian. The Zelthari were logical beings, methodical in all they did, so why, when the topic of Earth arose, did they refuse to speak of it? A delegate from the Kalor, a species renowned for its relentless pursuit of knowledge, raised a question that had been asked countless times before. Why is Earth a restricted zone? The humans pose no threat to the galactic order. They have not even achieved interstellar travel on their own. Lyrian leaned forward, watching the High Elder closely. The Zelthari seldom showed emotion, yet something flickered in the Elder's silver eyes. Not fear, but something deeper, something ancient. The High Elder exhaled slowly before responding, his voice calm but firm. "It is not humans we fear." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Lyrian narrowed his eyes. He had spent years studying galactic history, reading the restricted texts he could access, but there was no record of any prior contact between the Zelthari and Earth. Still, they avoided it as though it were a plague world. The Kalor delegate pressed further. "Then, what do you fear?" The High Elder said nothing at first. Then he turned his gaze toward Lyrian. "There is more on that planet than just humans." The hall fell silent. Lyrian felt a chill creep down his spine. He had expected another vague dismissal, not a direct statement. He opened his mouth to ask more, but the Elder had already stepped away from the podium, signaling the end of the discussion. For the rest of the assembly, Lyrian barely heard what was said. His mind swirled with possibilities. He had always assumed the Zelthari's stance on Earth was political, or perhaps even cultural, an old grudge against young species. But now he knew better. It wasn't reluctance, it was avoidance. An avoidance from a race as ancient and powerful as the Zelthari meant something far worse than politics. After the assembly adjourned, Lyrian made his way through the grand corridors of the council hall, his footsteps echoing against the polished obsidian floors. His superior, Counselor Zien, caught up with him, his expression unreadable. "Don't even think about it," Zien muttered. Lyrian stopped. "You heard what he said. Something is on that planet," Zien sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I've worked with you long enough to know when you've latched onto something. Listen to me, Lyrian. There are things in this galaxy better left alone." Lyrian crossed his arms. "And that includes Earth?" "Yes," Zan said without hesitation. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Lyrian stared at him for a moment, then glanced back toward the hall. The High Elder's words echoed in his mind. There is more on that planet than just humans. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat in his quarters, surrounded by holographic projections of Earth's history, its development, its wars. Nothing stood out as unnatural. It was a violent planet, yes, but hardly unique in that regard. If anything, humans had advanced rapidly despite their self-inflicted conflicts. Then he found something. A report, buried deep within the Council's restricted archives. It was incomplete, fragmented, as if someone had deliberately erased portions of it. The author's name was missing, the date redacted. But one section remained. Contact initiated with terrestrial intelligence unknown. Non-human presence detected. Attempt to establish communication resulted in... The text ended abruptly. No record of what happened next. No follow-up reports. Just silence. Lyrian's heart pounded. This wasn't a theory. This was real. The Council had known about something on Earth for a long time. He knew what he had to do. 3 days later, he was aboard a private vessel, engines primed for departure. Officially, his mission was a simple reconnaissance survey, standard procedure for cataloging planetary development. Unofficially, he was going to step foot on Earth and see for himself why the oldest species in the galaxy refused to go near it. As the ship launched into the void, he stared at the blue and green orb growing larger on the view screen. What was waiting for him down there? Lyrian's ship entered Earth's atmosphere with a controlled descent, its hull shielding him from the turbulence that came with breaching the planet's protective layer. The vessel's systems flickered briefly, adjusting to the shift in atmospheric pressure. His hands remained steady on the controls, his eyes fixed on the holographic display in front of him. The planet sprawled beneath him, oceans stretching endlessly, land masses carved by ancient geological forces, and scattered lights indicating dense human habitation. The ship's scanners ran a passive sweep, feeding him data about electromagnetic activity, radio signals, and temperature fluctuations. Everything appeared normal, yet an unease settled deep in his chest. He navigated toward the designated landing coordinates, a remote region untouched by modern civilization. The dense jungle canopy stretched in every direction, an emerald labyrinth concealing whatever secrets lay beneath. He activated the ship's cloaking field, ensuring no human technology would detect his arrival. As he neared the surface, the ship's sensors began to behave erratically. Instruments that had functioned perfectly moments ago flickered with interference. Power fluctuations pulsed through the system, forcing him to stabilize the descent manually. He exhaled sharply, tightening his grip on the controls. As soon as the landing skids touched the ground, the ship's systems failed completely. The cockpit darkened, emergency power flickering weakly to life. He attempted a reboot, but the controls remained unresponsive. The damp, oppressive air seeped through the hull, even though it should have been sealed. Something was interfering, something beyond standard electromagnetic interference. Lyrian unfastened his restraints and stood, his mind already working through the possibilities. The jungle outside was dense, the towering trees casting long shadows even in the midday light. He activated his wrist scanner, but instead of the expected environmental data, the screen flashed with distorted static. He frowned, adjusting the frequency, but the interference remained. He had encountered planets with high radiation, unpredictable weather, and unstable energy fields, but this was different. It felt deliberate. Stepping outside, he was met with the rich scent of damp earth and vegetation. The air was thick, pressing against his skin. The jungle was alive with sound. Distant calls of unseen creatures, the rustling of leaves, the rhythmic hum of insects. He moved carefully, his senses on high alert. The ground beneath his feet was uneven, covered in thick roots and fallen leaves that muffled his steps. He scanned the area visually, his equipment proving useless. He needed higher ground to assess his surroundings. A rocky outcrop rose ahead, partially concealed by the foliage. He made his way toward it, climbing the uneven surface until he reached a vantage point. From here, he could see the jungle stretching far into the horizon, an unbroken expanse of green. Then he saw movement. At first, it was subtle, a flicker of motion in the distance, something shifting between the trees. He narrowed his eyes, focusing on the area where it had disappeared. The jungle remained still. He waited, muscles tense, listening. The sounds of nature continued, uninterrupted, yet the sense of being watched settled over him like a weight. He descended carefully, retracing his path toward the ship. The moment he stepped back onto the clearing, he froze. Something had changed. The ground beneath the ship was disturbed, the surrounding foliage pressed down as though something had moved through. His ship's exterior bore faint streaks, as though touched by something that had left no fingerprints. Lyrian felt his pulse quicken. He was not alone. Drawing his sidearm, he moved toward the ship's entrance, scanning the area carefully. He stepped inside, sealing the hatch behind him. The ship remained dark, systems unresponsive. He tried another manual reboot. The command module flickered, then died again. His reflection in the darkened screen stared back at him, sharp features lined with tension. Then a sound echoed outside. A whisper. He turned sharply, his grip tightening on his weapon. The sound was soft, almost indistinct, like words carried by the wind. Yet no wind moved through the jungle. The trees stood still, the air heavy. He strained to hear, his heart pounding. The whispering did not come from one voice. It came from many. A deep, instinctive fear settled in his bones. Something was here, and it had been waiting for him. Lyrian remained perfectly still, his breath controlled, his pulse hammering in his ears. The whispers wove through the air like drifting smoke, their origin impossible to pinpoint. His mind raced through the possibilities. Was this a malfunction in his auditory systems, a trick of the jungle, or something worse? His training demanded he analyze before acting, but instinct told him there was no time for calculation. He moved swiftly, pressing himself against the inner hull of his ship, weapon raised. His eyes darted toward the viewport, scanning the jungle beyond. Nothing. The thick canopy cast shadows in every direction, the undergrowth shifting slightly in the humid breeze, yet the air inside the ship remained unnaturally still. Then the whispering stopped. The abrupt silence was worse than the sound itself. It was as if the jungle had drawn a slow breath and held it. He turned his attention to the control panel, fingers working quickly. The ship's power remained dead, its systems refusing to respond. He needed to get it running again. Without it, he was trapped. A faint pressure against the hull made him freeze. It was not a forceful impact, nor a scrape of claws or tools. It was lighter, almost imperceptible, as if something unseen was pressing its presence against the metal, testing its resistance. He pivoted toward the hatch, listening. The pressure vanished. He had to get outside. Lowering his weapon slightly, he pressed a manual override on the hatch. The mechanisms groaned as the door released. Humid air rushed in, carrying the rich scent of damp earth and vegetation. He stepped out, boots crunching softly against the ground. The jungle remained unchanged, yet it felt different. The sensation of being watched had intensified, like unseen eyes studying his every move. His gaze flicked toward the trees, scanning for movement. Then something shifted in his periphery. He turned sharply, raising his weapon. Nothing. Yet he had seen it. Something moving between the trees, faster than his mind could register. His breathing slowed as he tried to control the creeping tension tightening his muscles. A whisper curled through the air again. Not a voice, but a presence. He moved carefully, making his way toward the edge of the clearing. His wrist scanner remained unresponsive, offering no data on the anomaly. He was operating blind, relying on pure instinct. Then he saw the mark. Just beyond the clearing, etched into the trunk of an ancient tree, was a symbol. It was not human. The lines were too precise, the angles too deliberate. His pulse quickened as he stepped closer. The bark around the carving had darkened unnaturally, the wood beneath appearing almost scorched. He reached out, brushing his fingers along its surface. The moment his skin made contact, his mind recoiled. A flash of something old, something vast. A presence that stirred beneath the surface of reality itself. His vision blurred, his thoughts spiraling into a sensation that was neither memory nor dream. Then it was gone. He stumbled back, his breath ragged. His vision cleared, but the feeling remained, a lingering impression of something watching him from beyond the veil of perception. His fingers still tingled where they had touched the carving. He clenched his fists, forcing the sensation away. The whispers did not return, but the jungle felt heavier, more oppressive. He turned back toward the ship, his mind working through the implications. Someone or something had left that symbol. It was not a coincidence, and it had been waiting for him to find it. Lyrian forced himself to steady his breathing as he turned back toward his ship. His boots pressed into the damp earth, but his focus remained locked on the jungle's shifting edges. He no longer trusted what he saw. The shadows were deeper than before, thick with unseen movement. He kept his weapon raised, his grip firm, but a gnawing doubt coiled within him. He had encountered hostile environments, faced unknown threats, but this was different. This wasn't an enemy he could see, something he could fight or outmaneuver. The symbol on the tree still burned in his mind, the unnatural sensation lingering in his fingers. He resisted the urge to look back, to confirm whether the mark had changed or disappeared. Instead, he pressed forward, reaching the ship's open hatch in quick, measured steps. The air inside felt colder than before, though the humid jungle should have made the interior stifling. He stepped inside, securing the entrance behind him, and moved toward the control panel. The power remained dead. He ran a diagnostic, bypassing standard protocols, forcing the system to respond. A weak flicker of light pulsed through the cockpit before vanishing again. His fingers danced across the controls, rerouting energy from secondary reserves. But something resisted. It wasn't a technical failure. Something was interfering. Then he heard it. Not whispers this time, a single voice. It came from outside, low and measured. The words indistinct but unmistakably intentional. His pulse quickened, the voice did not echo through the jungle. It was close, too close. He reached for his sidearm, fingers tightening around the weapon's grip. The voice did not call out again, but the air inside the ship felt suffocating, thick with an unseen presence. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to think. He had no choice. He had to see who or what was out there. He disengaged the lock, stepping out with practiced caution. The jungle remained still. The clearing was empty. Yet the voice had been real. He was certain of it. His eyes swept the surroundings, every instinct on edge. Then he noticed something new. Another symbol. This one was carved into the ground at the edge of the clearing, the lines freshly etched into the dirt, precise and deliberate. The sight of it sent a ripple of unease through him. He had been gone mere moments. Someone had placed it there. His weapon remained raised as he approached. The pattern was similar to the one on the tree, but more intricate. He stopped a few feet away, studying it carefully. Then, from the depths of the jungle, a figure stepped forward. Lyrian reacted instantly, leveling his weapon at the shape emerging from the trees. It moved slowly, deliberately, the foliage parting around it without resistance. The dim light of the jungle played tricks on its form, distorting the edges of its silhouette. Then he saw it clearly. It was not human. The figure was tall, its frame elongated and unnaturally still. Its skin was dark, not in color but in the way it absorbed light, drinking it in rather than reflecting it. Its face was obscured, a shifting absence where features should have been. It did not move further. It only stood there, watching him. Lyrian's grip on his weapon remained steady, but his mind churned with questions. He'd encountered countless alien species, but nothing like this. The Jelthari had feared Earth not because of humans, but because of something else. He was staring at that something now. The figure raised a hand, slowly, purposefully. It gestured toward the symbol on the ground. Lyrian did not lower his weapon. The figure did not react. It simply remained where it was, waiting. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken meaning. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and stepped back into the jungle, its form vanishing into the darkness as if it had never been there. The air shifted, the jungle exhaled, the sounds of distant creatures returned. As if the presence had held everything in suspension. Lyrian stood motionless, his thoughts racing. He looked down at the symbol once more. It was not a warning. It was an invitation. Lyrian remained rooted to the spot, his gaze fixed on the symbol carved into the earth. The jungle had returned to its natural state, alive with distant sounds, moving with the slow rhythm of the wind, but the weight of what had just occurred lingered around him like an invisible force. The figure had vanished, but its presence still clung to the air, an unshakable imprint on reality itself. His weapon remained in his hand, but he no longer aimed it. The encounter had been neither hostile nor overtly threatening. The entity had made no aggressive movement, no attempt to communicate beyond the silent gesture toward the symbol, Yet Lyrian knew with absolute certainty that this was the answer he had come for. Earth was not abandoned. It was inhabited, not just by humans, but by something far older, something the Zelthari had feared enough to avoid entirely. He took a cautious step closer to the symbol, lowering himself to one knee to examine it. The markings were intricate, deliberate, forming a pattern that felt more like language than mere design. His fingers hovered just above its surface, but he hesitated before making contact. The last time he had touched such a mark, he had felt something vast and unknowable pressing against his mind. He needed to understand. Bracing himself, he allowed his fingertips to brush against the carved lines. A pulse of energy surged through his body, freezing his breath in his throat. His mind was no longer in the jungle, no longer in his body. He was somewhere else. Somewhere dark and endless, where time stretched in all directions at once. And then he saw a world before humans, before recorded history, before the first sentient beings had walked upright on this planet. He saw the sky torn open by forces beyond his comprehension, watched as beings not of this universe stepped through and claimed the land as their own. They were not conquerors, they were not invaders, they simply were. And then he saw their downfall. The Xthari had been here before, not as rulers, not as colonizers, but as desperate combatants in a war against something they could not destroy. The battle had stretched across centuries, unseen by the species that would one day inherit the world. The Xelthari had failed. They had not defeated these beings. Instead, they had sealed them away, binding them to the fabric of the planet itself, hoping that time and distance would keep them buried. But the seal was not perfect. It had never been perfect, and now it was weakening. Lyrian's mind snapped back into his body as he stumbled away from the symbol, gasping for air. His hands trembled, his pulse racing. The weight of knowledge pressed down on him, suffocating in its enormity. This was why the Zelthari avoided Earth. Not because of superstition, not because of politics, but because they knew the truth. They had imprisoned something here, something that should not exist, and now it was stirring. The entity from the jungle had not been an enemy, it had not tried to harm him. It had only shown him what was coming. Lyrian turned toward his ship. He had to leave. The ship's systems were still down, but he no longer cared about the technical failures. He understood now that whatever had interfered with his instruments had allowed him to see the truth. And now that he had seen it, he was no longer necessary. The presence that had held him here, that had whispered to him, that had guided him to this revelation. It was letting him go. He climbed back inside the ship, his movements mechanical. He sat in the pilot's seat, fingers moving across the controls, though he barely registered his own actions. A low hum vibrated through the vessel, and the screens flickered to life. The power had returned. The ship was operational again. The message was clear. Lyrian lifted off, breaking through the jungle canopy, pushing the ship toward the upper atmosphere. As Earth shrank below him, his mind remained tangled in the knowledge he had gained. He could return to the Council, deliver his report, warn them of what lay beneath the surface of the planet. But would they believe him? The Zeltari had chosen to keep this secret for a reason. If the truth was revealed, if the seal was disturbed any further, the consequences could be catastrophic. He exhaled slowly, gripping the controls. The answer was already clear. Earth was not to be interfered with, not by humans, not by the Zelthari, not by anyone. The galaxy's oldest species had avoided this planet for millennia. Now Lyrian understood why, and he would make sure no one else ever made the mistake of returning.